Chloe, thank you so much for talking to me today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation because I'm really, really interested in what you do. I just want to introduce to everyone Chloe Valderi. Chloe is based in New York, and Chloe Valderi teaches the theory of enchantment, which is specifically designed to improve social and emotional learning in schools, but particularly diversity and inclusion in all types of organizations. So to me, enchantment is about deep feelings of great pleasure, but more than that, it carries the idea to me of something magical that changes us. And Chloe, you have applied this to creating inclusion in the workplace. So could you just briefly explain the concepts behind the theory of enchantment and the kind of the results that you've seen as people learn about it?
Yeah, absolutely, Peter. And thank you for inviting me to have a discussion with you about this. So theory of enchantment is, and I want to emphasize this word enchantment, just as you did just now. It really focuses on this idea that the breakdown of inclusion happens, or you could say prejudice happens, bigotry happens, when we are feeling a lack of self-worth inside of ourselves. And then in order to cope with that feeling, we project those same feelings of personal inadequacy onto other human beings as a way to make ourselves feel better. And so theory of enchantment says that the only sustainable way to successfully combat that is to train us to get in right relationship with ourselves, with the fullness of ourselves, our complexities, our insecurities, right, our flaws, all the messiness of what it means to be human. And if we can learn how to get in right relationship with that, we'll be less likely to project those, let's say, insecurities onto others. We'll be more likely to catch ourselves when we fall into cognitive biases and traps, because we'll be training ourselves to be on the lookout for self-deception. And so in theory of enchantment, there are 3 principles that are our guideposts. And those 3 principles are: treat people like human beings, not political abstractions; criticize to uplift and empower, never to tear down or destroy; and try to root everything you do in love and compassion. So those are the 3 primary sort of principles. And then everything we do, all the modules, all the workshops that we build, are centered around those 3 principles.
Thank you, Chloe. That sounds wonderful. And I love those principles. They're so simple, yet so complex.
Yes.
But in most organizations, the leaders focus on developing inclusive policies and practices, and they add to that a bit of training to, for example, raise awareness of unconscious bias. So why do you think the theory of enchantment is so much more powerful in creating inclusion than those usual methods?
Well, a lot of the contemporary conventional methods to promote inclusion are, first of all, based on a very propositional approach. What do I mean by this? I mean, in trainings, you're usually asked to memorize definitions for terms and basic propositions for terms, right? That's not actually how behavior change occurs. Behavior change occurs, and we know this from 4E science, cognitive science. Behavior change actually occurs not just through memorizing propositions or what might be called propositional knowledge, but participatory means of knowledge, where you actually participate in the new shaping of your environment. You co-create your new environment together. And so theory of enchantment, in its, sort of training modules, certainly has that propositional wherewithal, but it also has participatory elements. And so, for example, there are embodiment practices in theory of enchantment. And this is very important because let's say I'm feeling a lack of self-worth, right? Let's say I'm feeling insecure. it's not, to feel insecure is not merely an intellectual exercise, right? To feel insecure is an embodied felt experience. And if I don't have the proper tools, the proper somatic tools to get in right relationship with those feelings in an embodied sense, and I only focus on trying to correct my intellectual frame, it's actually not going to work in the long run. That's number one. So on a purely practical matter, it doesn't result in behavior change. And then the second and perhaps more known reason why theory of enchantment is different from a lot of these other practices is that a lot of these other approaches to diversity and inclusion training end up perpetuating some of the same ways of being that we're actually trying to undermine. So for example, if you are in this is certainly the case for the United States, if you are in a training where you are basically taught that quote unquote whiteness is a set of different stereotypes, or includes a set of different stereotypes, including, for example, being privileged, right? That's like one of the more popular ones. You are still breaking the first rule of the theory of enchantment. You're still treating people, particularly white people, as though they are political abstraction, and you're not engaging with them as human beings with the full complexity of their lived experience. And simultaneously, if you're not a white person, you are also caricaturing yourself. There's this thing that happens with stereotype. We often think of stereotype as being directed towards another person, but actually stereotyping goes both ways. If I stereotype another group of people as, let's say, privileged, I am denying the fact that in certain contexts, I am also privileged. And vice versa, if I stereotype a group of people as lazy, let's say, I'm denying the fact that in certain contexts, I'm lazy, right? So by getting in right relationship with the fullness of who I am, I will be less likely to make that move in the first place, because I'll realize that I have the very same qualities that I'm seeing in others.
I love that. It sounds like the process of learning theory of enchantment is a lot about learning about yourself.
Yes.
Is that a fair comment? Yeah.
Absolutely.
And the more you understand yourself, the less likely you are to be prejudicial to others.
Yes, but I'll add one more caveat to that. You're learning about yourself. Ideally, you're learning about yourself in a community with others who are also learning about themselves. And the community piece is very important, because if you're going through a vulnerable experience, that is obviously going to shape you and shape, how you see the world and how you presence in the world. And it's much better to go through a vulnerable experience. And theory of enchantment is a vulnerable experience, I should say. Self-knowledge can be a very scary thing to discover. But if you're going through a vulnerable experience, it's best to go through it with other people who are also having that same vulnerable experience, who you can process with, who you can have a grounding exercise with, or several grounding exercises with. And that actually will create a kind of belonging, a sense of belonging that you'll have with those other people that are going through that. So it's not just discovery of the self in isolation. The communal piece is very, very important if this is to be successful.
Okay, that's great, because I work mainly with teams, and teams are kind of the fundamental unit in an organization. So if a team goes through this process together, I imagine that's a tremendous experience to bring them together and help them appreciate the strengths of one another.
Absolutely.
Also, I understand that stories play a major role in the teaching and learning process of theory of enchantment. And I know that you focus also on some of the Disney stories to help change attitudes that might work against inclusion. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so a lot of the things that I'm saying about understanding what's going on inside of yourself that's producing these outcomes that might be not beneficial for you, those teachings are actually found in a lot of our, you could say, fairy tales. So for example, Aladdin, the main teaching in Aladdin is do not be fooled by commonplace appearance. It's not what's on the outside, but what's on the inside that counts, right? That is said in the first 5 minutes of Aladdin. I mean, the film Inside Out is, literally on the nose, a Pixar film that explores this very issue. So, it's not just Disney. We have a lot of other pop culture references for sure throughout the curriculum, but a lot of these wise teachings can be found in pop culture references. And we use pop culture as a kind of teaching device to anchor people in what we are teaching them, because oftentimes people are already familiar with these stories. They grew up listening to them. They grew up watching them on the screen. And what we really want to have people understand is that these are not just for entertainment, right? The reason why we gravitate so strongly to stories like The Lion King and Aladdin is that they're actually teaching us something deep and profound about the human condition. And if we can internalize those, we can actually build a better world.
And many of those stories are based on really ancient fairy tales, aren't they?
Yeah,
which people understand at a very deep level. And what interests me about this is I work mainly in the Asia Pacific region. Every culture has their own sets of story tales, myths, and legends.
Sure.
And it seems like a lot of the things you talk about in Theory of Enchantment could be applied to these other myths, legends, and fairy tales as well.
Yeah, so I'll say something about the Asia Pacific region specifically. Two things to note for those who may be watching. The idea of a Zen koan, let's say, right? I just started recently studying Zen koans and the writings of different Zen Buddhist monks. And the Zen koan is a very interesting device used to teach a lesson. It's a paradox. And one of my favorite Zen koans is when, someone who's seeking enlightenment is asking a monk a question, and it's going in a very linear fashion, right?
Yes.
And then the Zen monk will say something like, ding! And he'll use like a mnemonic device or a musical device to essentially get the person who's asking the question to come into the present moment. I want you to think about that for a second. Come into the present moment. Do not be sullied by or saddled by baggage from the past, right? That might be influencing your way of seeing yourself and the other, right? Come into the present moment. This is what a Zen koan often does. And I would say that pop culture, the way we use it as a device, is essentially in a similar role. We're using it as a device to bring people into the present moment and to get them to understand that the very thing that they gravitate towards in a different context, right? In the context of just like, let me go to the movies and escape my daily life, maybe, is actually something you can bring into the foreground as opposed to the background. That's one thing I'll say that I think is relevant to Asia Pacific culture. The other thing I'll say is that we teach a model of integration. Integration is, the root word, or I should say related to the word integrity, right? And integration in the way we use it is all about, I keep saying this, but getting in right relationship with your fullness and with your complexity, which means getting in right relationship with what Carl Jung might say, the shadow and the light of your personality, of your full being. And we use the yin yang as a symbol to represent that. Because in the yin yang symbol, you see that dark and light are actually dependent upon each other. They can't exist one cannot exist without the other. And that is what we're really speaking to when we talk about getting in right relationship with the fullness of your complexity. Understanding that, my laziness in one context, which might manifest negatively, might actually be positive in a different area in my life, right? Seeing how my positive attributes and my opportunities for growth are actually interconnected. And so I just wanted to share that because I feel like it's very relevant specifically for the cultures that we're speaking about.
Yeah, great great points. One of the issues that keeps coming up in the region is that a lot of the cultures are very steeply hierarchical. So there are big power differences, not only in the workplace, but in society as well. And this manifests itself in positive and negative ways, right? In a positive way, it means there's greater respect for older people in the community and for parents and for older brothers and sisters. In a negative way, it means that people are often afraid to speak up with ideas and concerns to their boss. Do you think this is something that theory of enchantment would help with?
Yeah, I think so. I think whenever there is a feature of a culture which has, let's say, some negative consequences, like you just articulated, one is challenged to ask themselves, where does the, for example, fear of speaking up come from? What consequences does one fear might happen if one speaks up? Usually, oftentimes when one is afraid of speaking up, one is afraid of social isolation, and that one will be, expelled from the group or exiled from the group, which is a basic human fear, right? As being part of the human species, belonging is, something that we need in order to thrive. And so theory of enchantment might give people the tools and the space to wrestle with that and how that's playing itself out, and also give them the tools to practice speaking up more, to practice maintaining the balance, certainly being respectful of those who have come before us, but also being able to articulate oneself and also new ideas that don't necessarily, preclude what has come before or dishonor what has come before, but actually builds off of it, right? Like in Theory of Enchantment, we teach Stoicism from Marcus Aurelius, right? And all the great Stoics. This is a psychotechnology that came out, post Alexander the Great, right? So we definitely believe in showing respect for those incredible technologies that have come before us. And simultaneously, we teach that in conversation with the Lion King, because there are Stoic principles, right, in the Lion King. And so we show how the contemporary can be and stand in juxtaposition to, not even in juxtaposition, but in balance with the ancient. So yes, I do think that Theory of Enchantment could help people perhaps find their way in balancing these two values.
Yeah. And one of the things I'm hearing from what you say is that, our intellectual processes, our reasoning processes are affected very much by how we feel. And what you're working on is changing how people feel about these issues. And something I totally agree with and understand. Once we change our feelings, our reasoning process will follow that.
Yes. And I think that this is something that we in the West have not known for a very long time, for many different reasons, one of which was Descartes. We don't have to get into that. But let me be specific about what you mean by changing feelings. When you say changing feelings, or when I say changing feelings, I mean getting in right relationship with your feelings in the first place, right? What is a feeling? A feeling is really on a very embodied somatic level, right? If you were to just follow the rise and fall, the oscillation of sensation in the body, right? That in and of itself is a skill set to be able to discern that. You don't even have to necessarily jump to labeling that movement within the body. You can train yourself to become aware of that sensation in the first place, right? And once you do that, and this is also a very Eastern thing, once you're able to see how energies are constantly transmuting from hot to cold, from dark to light, from up to down, etc., you can actually reshape the way you come to relate to your emotions in the first place. So, for example, if I'm feeling angry, if I can train myself in this way, and there are different tools for this, meditation included, but if I can train myself to simply feel the anger, make space for the anger without, number one, suppressing it or repressing it, but also without necessarily acting on it. If I can just be with this sensation of anger then I will find that it will transmute into another feeling, because the nature of everything is change, right? So on a very, I would say, somatic and also, neurological level, we can train ourselves to be in better relationship with these feelings, with these emotions as they rise and fall, so such that we can get in right relationship with them and not project them onto others when we're feeling, but it takes a lot of time. Remember, we're dealing with millions of years of biology here. So it
Yeah.
takes practice in order to be able to live in this way. And I, by no means, am an expert in the highest sense of the word. Everything that I'm saying to you, I also have to practice on a daily basis.
We're all subject to these prejudices and biases, aren't we, Chloe? And the sooner we realize and recognize and accept that, the better.
Absolutely.
It's all about it, I think, as you've explained, being in touch with the darker side of not only ourselves, but our culture as well, and accepting that there is actually strength and there's value sometimes in that darkness, isn't there? And in integrating that and making it whole.
Yes, in order for a tree or a plant to survive or to thrive, really, you don't plant a seed in the light. You plant a seed in the rich, dark soil of the earth. And you give it water and you give it a little light, but you don't blind it with light. And I'm making a distinction here a little bit between the Enlightenment, right, which was really, from an aesthetic perspective, about blinding light, as opposed to, again, I want to remind you of the yin yang symbol, which is about this interplay between light and dark and getting the harmonies right, such that that seed can grow into its fullness. And that's what we're really talking about here with the theory of enchantment.
I love that analogy. It's so powerful, planting the seed in the dark soil, and that's what enables it to grow, isn't it? Yeah. So, Chloe, it's been wonderful talking to you. So interesting. I think we could probably talk about this for hours, but if people want to learn more about the theory of enchantment and how it helps to build inclusive workplaces, how can they get in touch with you and your team?
Yeah, just go to our website, theoryofenchantment.com. Check out the resources there. We have plenty of free resources for people if anyone's interested. We also have our links to our online course. And of course, if anyone's interested in getting in touch and maybe bringing on the full curriculum to their workplace, to their teams, they can go on our pages and send us a note, and we'll have someone be in touch.
Great. I hope we can bring Theory of Enchantment to the Asia Pacific region. I think it would be of great value. So thank you so much for talking today, Chloe. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Peter. Appreciate it.